Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Elevate the Research Behind the Initiative, hosted by ESO's own John MacLaughlin, Director of Policy and Research. My name is Allison Mullen, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Marketing at Essential Skills Ontario. Before we get started, I just want to give you a few instructions. On the right-hand side of your screen is your dashboard. And there you can chat with each other in the chat pane and ask questions in the questions pane. If it's a technical question, just ask and we'll try to get to you immediately. And if you have questions about the content of the webinar, ask at any point, and I'll ask John throughout, as we want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. And as always, the webinar will be recorded and available online to you afterwards to be shared. And if you'd like to participate and keep the conversation going on Twitter, just use the hashtag ESOWeb. So now to introduce our presenter. My colleague John MacLaughlin has a long and distinguished career in the literacy field, both in Canada and internationally. He was the founding executive director of the Preparatory Training Program, also known as PTP, one of the largest community-based literacy programs in Ontario. At Essential Skills Ontario, John is leading a number of initiatives and applied research related to labor market development, effective program design, performance improvement, and accountability. And he's going to tell you about some of that research today. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Allison. I appreciate that. I always, whenever I hear my bio, I think, oh my goodness, after 35 years, that's all I've done. Also, I'd like to take this opportunity. The last couple of weeks have been a whole variety of presentations, and I have Amber Haas sitting beside me, and she's just done a tremendous job of pulling all of these things together. So very much my appreciation, Amber.
Well, thank you.
One of the major interests here at Essential Skills Ontario is trying to find and discover if there are new delivery models that can better meet the needs of low-skilled adults. This follows a line of inquiry, and in our office I feel like we spend a lot of our time talking and examining such things. But we're asking a number of questions. How effective is the current workforce development system in moving low-skilled job seekers into employment and the low-skilled into better jobs? For lack of a better phrase, the working poor. What types of approaches, design models, and service coordination might actually work best to address these challenges? What evidence is available to suggest certain types of interventions, systems, and or model designs are more effective than others? And this is absolutely critical, right? So we have a lot of stories and we have a lot of things that anecdotally we say work, but we don't always have the kind of evidence that truly indicates that it's effective. And more importantly, it's not always clear what is effective for whom. So a number of interventions may have positive workforce and labor market results, but we don't know if those results are the same for lower skilled individuals, and in particular, those without a high school diploma. Oops, it tries. So what are the effects on different populations, the whom, as I was mentioning before, and in different locations? So something that might work in fabulous downtown Toronto may actually not work in Timmins. And finally, as ESO is involved in a number of demonstration projects at this time, we have a keen eye that if these interventions and things that we're working on are effective, how can we replicate them and bring them to scale, right? So basically that's my way of saying is that we don't want to do research in a test tube. And we'll see a bit more of that as we go along through the presentation, right? So what are the things that we're doing so that it ends up, if effective, not just being a one-off project? So the seemingly intractable problem. Adults with the lowest levels of literacy and essential skills and educational attainment tend to be our most vulnerable citizens. This group of individuals are more likely to face persistent poverty and be on some form of income support. The recent PHPHRC data really emphasized a number of things that clearly relate earnings, skill levels, and educational attainment. Also should be noted, and we're going to be having a paper coming out on this very shortly, is that the PHPHRC data also tells us the low-skilled are the least likely to participate in education and training, either in the workplace or on their own time. Furthermore, as documented by both Don Drummond and Francis Lankin and their recent, well I guess they're not so recent anymore, reports that there's actually little evidence to suggest that current interventions for low-skilled individuals on income support have any significant socioeconomic impact. So what is some of our observations about the challenges with the system? Right? The reality is we have lower rates of client enrollment in basic skills programs than we would like. There's low rates of client persistence. As recently seen in the Employment Ontario Information System, a new rigorous data system in Ontario, that there was actually far fewer non-high school graduates in basic skills programs than we expected. Long program duration required to achieve meaningful goals, right? So if an unemployed person on income support had to go to a basic skills program, then move on to post-secondary education, and in a purely sequential manner, it might take a very long time. Clearly, there are gaps between classroom learning and actual on-the-job skills. There is a limited range of necessary client supports, and I really want to emphasize this when we start to examine what seems and has evidence of working elsewhere, that this may be one of the most critical pieces. So, our project, graciously funded by the federal government, is a 2-year project that is testing integrated training models in the food processing industry. And I think I get asked this a lot. Why did you choose the food processing industry to work in? Well, the food processing industry is actually very exciting. It is one of Canada's and Ontario's fastest growing industries. It is also undergoing what economists describe as skills-biased technological change, i.e. new equipment. It is also an industry that lends itself to accessibility for those without high educational attainment levels. In a world where certificates and diplomas are getting, well, as some would say, overvalued, it is an industry that appreciates and understands other skills that may not be learned in a more traditional academic environment. It seemed like an ideal place to do some of this work. So over the first phase of our work, we wanted to look at integrated LES and skills training, right? So I've had a long and abiding interest in integrated training that combines literacy, numeracy skills along with some of the other essential skills with real hands-on skills. And when I was with another organization, we worked with IKEA and a variety of other employers to really bring real hands-on vocational skills to literacy participants. We quickly learned that it wasn't the only integrated program. Francophone community was doing this as well. But they were very different models. And as we look across the many jurisdictions that have created some form of integrated training, we noticed that there's many different iterations. So it wasn't like we could look at the IBEST program in Washington State and say, oh yes, that's the definitive model of integrated literacy and skills training. But there was some generalities that we can draw, right? Integrating training contextualizes essential skills, or in other jurisdictions, literacy and numeracy skills, with job-specific skills with the aim of securing more immediate employment. As I mentioned, there's many different iterations. Two of the most common are bridge programs, programs that are short in duration and will take someone and support someone from moving from a basic skills program into a workplace, and sectoral approaches. And while I don't want to get too detailed, that could be another day, we've tried to integrate what we see is the best of both of those particular models. So we did see, in looking at many of these, looking for hard evidence that such things work, is there is promising evidence and data from programs such as IBEST in Washington State, programs funded by SkillWorks in Boston, and Fast Track in Minnesota. Right? And the indicators that they have is that for vulnerable and low-skilled participants, that they're going to have higher rates of program completion or persistence. They will more immediately get employed in a number of these programs, and their future earnings are higher than for those who've participated in more traditional basic skills programs or other interventions. So during this process, we asked some questions. What can we learn from other jurisdictions? What has been most effective for low-skilled individuals on income support? What can be replicated, and how can these models be adapted to the Canadian context? So there's a number of these models that are reliant on some particular mechanism that is part of that state, province, or jurisdiction that would not be possible in our context. What would the model look like? You know, we can't find something straight off the shelf. How will we know if the model is any more effective than anything else? Right? So that became something really important for us, right? It's not just to do it and think that it worked, but to actually find out if it did work, and if so, what worked well within the context of this work. Right? And finally, I return to that thing. If effective, how can it be replicated and brought to scale? So some of the characteristics of effective integrated training programs across many jurisdictions we saw: further, faster, better. A clear sight line to employment. Clients who are on income support, regardless of jurisdictions, want a job. They often haven't had very good past experiences in educational systems. The challenges that they first encounter are likely to persist, and a variety of studies indicate that nothing can possibly mimic the kinds of skills and behaviors you get from a job. Demand-driven. That there really needs to be explicit industry involvement. And by explicit, too often that means that you're using an employer's logo, or you have a meeting, or they're on an advisory group. The relationships, and by the way, we know they're difficult to establish need to be far more granular in nature. There needs to be a robust understanding of what skills are required in a specific occupation. Once again, from integrated programs that we've seen elsewhere that don't seem to be effective, it's often a program assuming what occurs in the workplace instead of knowing or discovering what actually works in a workplace. And too often, the iteration of what employment looks like too often looks like a manager's job, right? Which the reality is for low-skilled individuals on income support, it's not likely to be the job they're going to get. They have to be specifically designed to address the challenges faced by those with complex needs, as per Don Drummond, or, as Francis Lankin would describe them, distant from employment. Too often, programs have a wide blanket, whereas some evidence from elsewhere tells us that you need to deliberately design certain programs and with an eye towards this specific group. Also, most of the successful programs we saw use data for continuous program improvement. A program that understands that it didn't get it right the first time will keep using data to make it better. And by the way, one of the more successful programs, iBest in Washington State, every single staff member in their programs are taught to use data, whether it's for intake, instruction, evaluation. Every section, in an iBest case, it's in a college, looks over data. So in designing Elevate, we saw 4 important components that I like to think, are being very deliberate in how we are going about the work. The first piece is we're using an enhanced job requirement approach, and I'll come back to what that is in a minute, to determine what skills are needed for entry-level food processing occupations. We have designed and developed an integrated essential skills delivery model that incorporates vocational skills, industry exposure, with the right mix of essential skills. We will be testing the model at 10 sites with a variety of providers in different contexts throughout Ontario. And I may return to this point, but I'm going to make it now anyways, that we could have just done the training ourselves or utilized private contractors. It became an essential ingredient, no pun intended, of the project is to use real providers across our communities in Ontario. Because, again, we do not want this work to occur in a test tube, and we also want to measure the adaptability and flexibility of provision. It needs that, or it won't be replicable. And of course, we are collecting rigorous quantitative and qualitative data to determine the efficacy of the training and the return on investment, as well as capturing emergent learning for the purposes of replication, right? So as we go through the process, we want to document what were the challenges, what were the highlights, and what were things needed improvement if the model proves to be effective. So the first piece that we went through, and that was defining job-specific skills through an enhanced JRA approach. Well, what the heck is a JRA, let alone what is an enhanced JRA? So job requirements approach. It's a particular methodology that is used to capture what types of skills are used. And there are a number of methodologies aside from the JRA that does that. But in particular, the JRA examines how frequently these skills are applied. It didn't just pop out of nowhere. It's used by the British Skills Survey, the Italian Survey of Organizational Learning and Competencies, as well as part of ONET, which is an occupational database in the United States. It was used in the recent program for international assessment of adult competencies from last year to determine how skills are utilized in the workplace. The JRA method consists of asking individuals about the importance of different types of tasks that they may be performing in their jobs, and subsequently inferring the types of skills that are required from their answers. The method only provides an indirect measure of individual skills. It is assumed that their skills match the requirements of their job and/or individuals who are able to mold their jobs to their own skills. So it has some challenges. And here's a pretty picture that shows what it sort of measures. Cognitive skills, physical skills, social skills, and learning skills. So we decided that we would develop an enhanced job requirement approach. So the traditional JRA infers, and it doesn't level. It's about time spent, not complexity or the importance. It lists interaction, but not the context. Right? Are they trying to solve a problem, or is it just idle conversation? And of course, with the PIAC, it was self-reported, right? And had proxy measures. So since we were going to go in and do observations and examine these occupations, we wanted to take the best of what was in the JRA and then enhance it. So we're looking at actual skills and the levels of each direct measure. We're examining, as we're in a number of food processing plants and doing job shadowing and discussions with employees, we're understanding and documenting the importance to the job and not merely the time spent on that task or skill. The complexity in actually using the skill, right? Which is, PIAC describes it as complex problem solving in technology-rich environments. We're also using a variety of techniques, aside from surveys, to capture information, including observations and interviews. Right? And we've been doing an awful lot of observing and an awful lot of interviewing. And, well, the team here, I think, is having an awful lot of fun talking to these folks. So what have we learned through this process? And we haven't fully completed all of the JRAs, but most. So what is some of the emergent learning? The NOC codes and other occupational standards do not, and I should have probably underlined that, Amber, reflect what is actually required for these occupations. They just don't capture at all. There's a far higher emphasis on soft skills, aptitude, and organizational fit than is what is captured in any of the traditional occupational descriptions. Many of these jobs can be physically demanding or require dexterity. Many of these jobs do not require a high school diploma and have limited traditional literacy and numeracy requirements. And we'll return to that in a bit. But the way in which people read, write, converse, communicate are vastly different than they might be in different occupations, or certainly than we normally would see in very many classrooms. Interestingly, there are job opportunities with family-sustaining wages within this industry. I think too often there is an assumption that these are minimum wage jobs with no benefits, and we've found in the places we've been is the opposite to be true. And in many cases, if not most, the employers we've worked with are looking actively for employees. They often have high turnover because it isn't a right fit, right? So some of the things we've learned is perhaps more important than many other skills, being able to tolerate a cold environment, being able to stand on your feet for 8 hours. These are many of the things that are actually quite important, as opposed to me being able to sit for 8 hours. So as we went through the process of doing the JRAs, they were critical in informing us about the model that we have pretty much fully designed and will be delivering. So some of the key features that are going to be part of the Elevate demonstration site. So as I just mentioned, the model, the curriculum, and content are all informed by the JRA, right? So that the information that we found from talking to not only the employees or entry-level workers or second-level workers, but also from conversations with human resource departments, supervisors, leads, etc. Right? And it's been remarkable about what we've learned, and actually I should note how gracious food processing firms have been with their time. Content and delivery will occur through active collaboration with employers, right? So once again, we're not going to assume, whether it's about the curriculum or the model design, that it's correct unless it's informed by a local employer. And I'll return back to that. It needs to be local. We have to be as authentic as possible. Once again, authentic is easy to say, hard to do. But it really needs to include exposure to actual workplaces, simulations in the classroom, and hands-on experience. What I think in many cases, and I did this presentation a few weeks ago, and someone said to me, this kind of looks like, when you talk about this, like an informal apprenticeship. And yes, I would say that that's correct. So many of the elements you'll see are the best parts of an apprenticeship. What we've learned from elsewhere is that training needs to be compressed, intensive, and lead directly, or as directly as possible, to employment, rather than being aimed at further institutional or formal training, right? We need to have a very clear vision of what will happen at the end of the training. And it needs to be really clear to participants as well. The LES, essential skills, need to be contextualized, and the right essential skills need to be emphasized and done concurrently with the gaining of vocational skills. Some other elements, again, I'll return to this. A range of soft skills have to be fully integrated into the program, as opposed to occurring at the beginning or the end or related strictly to other supports. the counseling and mentoring aspect of the program will occur simultaneously with everything else. Classroom training will be congruent with orientation training provided by employers and will incorporate industry requirements, for example, WHMIS. As I mentioned before, include a very extensive case management for additional supports, things like daycare, childcare, transportation. And one of the things that we've learned from actually outside of any integrated basic skills program elsewhere is this concept of post-employment support, mentoring, and counseling, so that your relationship does not end with the participant the day they start work. If we're truly working with more vulnerable individuals, a simple training program will not immediately resolve some of these challenges, right? We know that from, or I know that anyways from my experience in working in other programs, that we really need to extend some of the supports well past from the day they got their first paycheck. We are having rigorous data collection, including a pre- and post-assessment of traditional LES skills, and a measurement of soft skills, and in particular issues around motivations. We will also be measuring the employment outcomes and some longitudinal data related to employment outcomes. So not did they get a job, but we want to know, do they have a job 3 months later, 6 months later, so on. Also is important is we want to develop an understanding around employer satisfaction, not necessarily about employer satisfaction with the training program per se, but the employer satisfaction with the individuals who come out of Elevate, right? Were they good? Are they good employees? What are the challenges, etc. So the model that we just painted for you before is going to be tested in 10 sites across the province. We will be providing to 215 trainees with clear criteria on participant characteristics with a laser-like focus on the long-term unemployed who do not have high school attainment. And this is really important when we particularly look at both the PEAC data and the 2011 census, right? That this group comprises a significant portion of those who are on long-term income support, right? So we really want to make sure that we're comparing, or we're looking at and making recommendations about a specific group of folks, right? We don't, for lack of a better sort of picture, we don't necessarily want to look at recent newcomers, those individuals who already have either a high school diploma or post-secondary education, but may have some other challenges going on in their lives or reasons why they're not employed. No. We really want to see what works for the low-skilled. We're working with a variety of employers in different food processing subsectors. And if you'd talked to me, 12 months ago, I would have never assumed or even known that there were so many subsectors in food processing. It is actually quite a large and important industry. And actually, in terms of the number of jobs, because food processing, by classification, is a subsector of manufacturing, but food processing has now overtaken automotive as the single largest industry section of manufacturing. The sites are going to be across Ontario. with a variety of trainers, right? So we're not just using one training body or one type of a training body, right? So it won't solely be through a community college or a private trainer or a community group. It will involve a variety of different providers because we want to be able to see how well they can adapt to this particular delivery model. Our demonstration sites are going to be staggered. They're occurring in batches, and they will be iterative. So when we run the first couple of programs, they will inform the next couple of programs, and so on and so forth, right? This is all part of an emergent learning framework, right? We know the first model that we run and program that we run won't be perfect, right? So we'll have to look at each one of the dimensions and try and say, okay, well, how can we improve upon that? We are having an independent evaluation, and we're looking at summative and formative data. And once again, the sort of quantitative data, and we're being very rigorous about collecting data related to participant characteristics and a whole range of things, and I'll come to that in a moment. But also the formative part is really important, not just how we did the model, but what occurred as we implemented the model. Very important for replication. Evaluating the efficacy of the intervention. So for us, this is a very important aspect, right? Again, we, at the end of the day, if it works, want to have evidence that it did. So we're using a quasi-experimental control group, as say opposed to a randomized control group, to compare the outcomes of the training participants and compare them with a control group comprised of individuals with similar characteristics who have been part of another intervention, i.e., we want to compare, or will be comparing, apples to apples. So we won't be comparing, a left-handed water skier without a high school diploma, right, who's been out of the workforce for 5 years, with, a recent immigrant with a PhD, right? We want to be able to say, did this work for this particular group, the group for whom there seems to be so many challenges? We will be calculating the return on investment based on a number of elements. Employment gains, right? So did they achieve employment? Their earnings, so not just did they get a job, but what kind of job and what was their earnings like? The reduction in the use of income support, the other side of the coin, and the cost of the actual intervention. Formative evaluations. How did the training model work, and how effectively did trainers apply the model, right? Maybe it's too difficult to use, right? Is the model that we designed far too esoteric and outside of the real world to actually be applicable? I don't think that's true, but it could be, right? Also, as part of that, how replicable is this model, particularly if it's effective, to other industries, other sections of manufacturing, right? Other occupations and sectors which are accessible to lower skilled individuals. And finally, before we move on to questions, I think this is really important. we are quite open to the idea that this may not work, be effective, be replicable, right? I like to think that everyone here at ESO are learners and not knowers, that we are not sure this will work. We, based on evidence and talking to folks in other jurisdictions about what they have evidence around what is effective, tells us that this work will be promising, but there are many, many, many reasons why this could not be as effective as we would like. And I think that that's really important, not just for this project, but for other projects, whether done at ESO or by other agencies as well. I've been around for 30 some odd years in the field, and many would think that that's about 30 years too long, that I think just about every project and program I've read a report on was incredibly successful. We have 30 years of history of successful endeavors, right? And partly that's because we feel pressure from government to articulate back successful results, right? We feel those pressures. Hopefully we can move into an era where there's sort of more honesty. Honesty not only with the funders, but with ourselves, right? And for anyone who's looking for some good reading, if you go to SkillWorks in Boston, and anyone can email me, I'll send them the website address, is during the formative periods of SkillWorks, you know, the much lauded and a very effective program in Boston. Their first 3 years basically produced failure reports. They don't call them failure reports, but they really document the things that didn't work. They were not afraid of talking about the things that didn't work. So that in terms of my learning, in fact, in learning to design this piece, we learned so much, not just from talking to the folks at SkillWorks, but reviewing their materials, right? What parts of the counseling worked for some, what parts of counseling didn't work for others. So I learned way more from their early writing than once they sort of had honed it to a perfect craft. So, Allison, I think, once again, we want to acknowledge the Office of Literacy and Essential Skills from Employment and Social Development Canada. And now we move on to any questions that someone might have.
Okay, we have a few questions here. So how did you engage employers in the food processing industry? How was that process?
So we've worked over the first part of the project very closely with the Food Processing Human Resource Council, and they helped us to identify a number of employers across the province who we should go out and talk with, and everyone that they sent us to, we've had great conversations. So that's how we sort of, if I dare even say it, infiltrated the industry. And as I note, every place that we've been in, staff have been incredibly gracious about not only their time, and these places are really busy, but about letting us do these JRAs. And we have so many good stories about, also about some of these entry-level workers. Every time the team goes out and meets with these folks, they come back with some great stories. And you also hear about how much, like, you know, I've seen some of these jobs. I'm not necessarily know that it would fit my aptitudes. But there's some folks that we come back who so love their jobs. And one woman said that this was like her dream. Working in this industry was like her dream.
Okay. We have a question here from Joyce. What are the key principles that underpin the curriculum development model that was adopted in Elevate?
Can I get you to repeat that again?
Sure.
What was the key?
What are the key principles that underpin the curriculum development model that was adopted in Elevate?
Right. Well, in terms of the curriculum development, it really needs to reflect on the actual types of documents and activities that are occurring within that workplace, and more particularly within that job. So you utilizing, the materials that are actually being used within the context of that industry, particularly the important kinds of documents. We've been comparing both documents and activities with, the essential skills matrix and weighting which items are important. And by the way, so when we've already done that, gone through the essential skills, lists and levels. And it's very intensive in certain sections, right, communications. Other sections, like, say, numeracy, the requirements are not very high, right? Other areas, they're quite high. So what we've really tried to do is match what is really occurring on the job to what materials and curriculum they'll be receiving. That is an underpinning principle, right? That we had to as closely look at mimicking what is on the job. In fact, it's going to mimic it so much that part of it will be on the job in order to give someone a real understanding of what is required on the job, and also give them the kind of training so that they'll be able to do it on the job.
Okay, another question here. Interesting pilot. I like the approach to the proposed demonstration projects for the pilots. How will you identify the variables to measure at the outset? It will be a challenge to isolate the client from the context in which the training will inevitably be implemented. For example, a mix of low-level literacy and newcomers with PSE experience. I'm trying to think what PSE.
Yeah, so there's actually a number of questions there, all of which I will attempt not to answer. Well, first off, we're having very strict screening criteria, right? So the providers will be given sort of, and by the way, and we're going to have a number of checks and balances to make sure that this is true. So that, for example, no one, for the most part, sort of, will be in the program who already has high school attainment, right? We're not going to take a recently laid off worker. So all of those criteria with sort of data fields will be clear to all those involved, right? And so I guess there was another part of that question about some of the other variables. So as much as possible, we're going to try and have similar groups of folks, right, in the training to limit the number of variables, right? Even for those without a high school diploma. If they pass a certain skills threshold, right, they won't get into the program. We're keenly aware that this is a research project, right? Well, there's 250 people involved, and we're going to go and do as much as we can so that every individual is successful. But at the end of the day, we want to have as bulletproof results as possible, right? And I've seen been involved in other demonstration projects where it wasn't clear to me, for example, how many were actually newcomers in that program design. And then that's when you get the kind of awkward looks around the room, right? Because so often the most successful participants are actually recent newcomers. Their upward trajectories around learning are often better than those who at one point in time were a high school dropout. So Allison, I don't know if I actually answered that, but as good as I can.
Yeah, I think you got there. So Elevate is only focusing on the essential skills development of new staff and not existing employees. That's another question for you.
That is correct. That this training is for long-term, well, not I mean long-term, but those who've had itinerant work histories, tenuous attachment to the labor force, and low skilled. We have another project that we're doing around that, and so, stay tuned for your webinars, right?
Good pitch there.
So I guess it's like, so we're working in a number of communities on career ladders, which is, is an approach that gives people additional skills, workers in entry-level employment, that gives them the kinds of skills, if to mobilize the community so that they take on the issue of people who are stuck in entry-level jobs, so that they can get some occupational progression. It should be noted that in really successful jurisdictions, you have bridge programs like what we're testing in Elevate, and you have career ladders or career pathways methodologies, right? To be successful, to permanently move, the lower skilled into family-sustaining wages and give them the right mix of skills, you need both. You really need both. And we see that in Washington State. Washington State has the very successful IBEST program, which, by the way, is being replicated across the U.S. now. But they also have career pathways as well, right? So they're not just moving people into entry-level employment, they're supporting them in moving up that occupational ladder.
Perfect. And there should be a Career Ladders webinar, say April or May. So stay tuned for that. How are you going to measure motivational levels of potential candidates, and what will be your criteria and what you're looking for regarding motivation levels?
That instrument is just currently being selected, but we're sort of using some more simple grit scales from what I know. That's I can't delve really deep into that on the phone, but if someone sends me that question, I can direct it to the person who's responsible for the instrument.
Okay, perfect. Do you expect this model to be transferable to another different industry?
I hope so, but it would be disingenuous for me to say yes. We suspect that that is the case. We'll know more, right, as we go along. Well, it's sort of interesting things is we thought, so I'll answer another question instead of the one that's really being asked. Right, so one of the first questions we asked, and we've been in many food processing plants, and not all in the same subsectors, we're thinking, okay, when it comes to, food processing worker and entry level, how common are their jobs? Right? How different is it at plant A to, say, plant B, who's actually producing another product? Right? So we were thinking, when we started to get almost into fits of despair before we actually went into many of these plants, we were thinking we might have to design a separate program for every single food processing hub in Ontario. And no, there's quite a bit that is common across food processing firms. Right? Some of the expectations are different. Some of the physical stuff is different. But there's an awful lot in common, and enough that the model will certainly be replicable across different food processing sectors. I suspect, given what I've seen from the American Manufacturing Institute and their manufacturing certificates, that this would actually fit within the rest of manufacturing. Whether or not it could apply to hospitality, retail, etc., I'm a little uncertain. I hope so, but that will be the end of our project, where we're going to examine, the entire model, what can be transported, what cannot be transported.
Okay, I think we have time for about one or two more questions. How is this model culturally adapted and applicable to First Nation communities?
We're more than willing to share the results, and it wasn't designed with any particular eye to Aboriginal communities. But, you know, that's a question that others are probably better able to answer than me. But we're sure one of the things in our efforts to be as transparent and open and be a real organization about theory of change is as we go through the process, we'll be sort of doing reports about what's working and what's not working, particularly after we're finished the first batch. And we're more than willing to share the data, results, and actually talk through who this model may or may not be applicable to. Right? Once again, under the whole theory of change and being replicable is we really want to involve people in the process, right? We want both employers and providers and potential workers to see themselves as part of a process. So we're going to be sharing a lot of information as we go through, and to try and not be proprietarial, particularly if it's effective, in any way. We're going to be, you know, as they say, just pick up the phone and call me or call Ron or whomever. Or call Amber.
Is it too early to target other industries that could benefit from a similar model, and are there likely candidates already known?
I would say, you know, just from my conversations with other industry sectors, that there's 3 or 4 that we think, and by we I mean sort of, well, I'll just describe it, some folks within business and industry I talk to on a regular basis, where we think that this model, with a few slight adaptations, would be effective, right? So it's like, if you take a look at the IBOS model in Washington, there's an awful lot of common elements across a number of industries, but there are some things that are different as well, right? So, you know, when they do one for manufacturing, it's got some of the same components, job mentoring, blah, 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 in forestry as it does in manufacturing, but in the forestry piece, it's way more focused on some additional hands-on skills, right? Getting actually far more time outside of the classroom. And of course, that makes sense, right?
Okay, well, we're coming up to 2 o'clock, and I don't want to keep people any longer than we have put out. But if you have questions, John's email is down there at the bottom, and he's very good at answering emails, right, John?
Normally.
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 Yeah.
Yeah, no. And if anyone does want to talk about the model, or, you know, want to get more than you would get from, you know, a webinar or something, you know, please don't hesitate to ask. This is, I think, Allison and the rest of the staff here know for me, the integrated training has been a long-standing interest, not only for myself, but some other staff members here. We're exceptionally passionate about wanting it to work. We know it might not, but we want it to, because, you know, we've been spending an awful lot of time we have a number of data analysts now on staff looking at the data, and really the skills divide is becoming so great, and those without a high school diploma, we really, it's almost like a moral imperative, have to find better solutions than the current mixture of things that are going on. And we're not alone in that in Ontario or in Canada. This is an issue that many people are struggling with, and we hope to be part of an answer and hope to bring others into that answer as well.
Perfect. So thank you, everyone, and I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but there are other ways to speak. And thank you, John.
Cheers. Bye, everyone, and thanks for your time.